Good afternoon to all of you, and particular word of welcome, wholehearted welcome to our guests these days, today and tomorrow, and our guest lecturer for this afternoon, Dr. Donald Abelson, who arrived yesterday on a very typical Catalan day called Sant Jordi and had the possibility of immerse himself into the Catalan environment. Good afternoon to all of you. I also want to seize the occasion to welcome our friends from France, who are very modestly put themselves behind in the back. Please stand up. Alim Seleli and Olivier Urrutia, who are from the Observatoire International des Think Tank, and Francesc Ponce, who I do not see. Francesc is over there, who is of the Spanish office of the Observatoire International, which is at the Pompeu Fabra University. Why do I name our guests? Not only because some of them will participate tomorrow in the roundtable, but because basically they are somewhat responsible for this event. Because as you all know, via our university bulletin, our faculty passed last year an agreement with the Observatoire International des Think Tank with three main ideas. Firstly, to arrange with them together internships in international think tanks. Secondly, to conclude agreements with foreign universities. And thirdly, to promote joint initiatives on issues related to think tanks. Thus, the current initiative, and today, which brings us here together, is the first and certainly not the last initiative of this, of a hopefully very long list. And as you all know, and as we try to explain, this initiative has at least two parts. Today we have the masterclass on behalf of Professor Abelson on think tanks in international relations, and tomorrow at 12:30 in the same room in the auditorium, we have a roundtable on the role of think tanks in international relations, in whom will participate Professor Abelson, Selim Alili of the Observatoire International des Think Tank, Edouard Solé of the CIDOP, and will be moderated by Diego Muro, who some of you know, and who is Associate Professor of International Relations of our faculty. Today, however, in order to have a good debate and to follow the debate tomorrow, we have to make an introduction, and an introduction to what think tanks, or Laboratoire d'idées, or how they say in German, Denkfabriken, are, what their role is in international relations, and last but not least, also, what kind of job perspectives they might offer to all of you. In recent years, we've seen an increase in number and an influence of think tanks on the 5 continents. This was recently demonstrated once again by the very good and well-marketed Global Go-To Think Tank ranking published by the University of Pennsylvania. This so-called 2014 Go-To indexes identifies more than 6,800 think tanks across a variety of different categories. I guess you will speak about this. Think tanks in this index were judged on a set of 28 criteria, including quality, reputation, research, analysis, produced, academic performance, website, digital presence, and overall impact on society. With regard to international relations, the list was led by the Brookings institutions, and in Western Europe, one of our neighbors, the CIDOP, holds the 16th rank in the Western European think tanks and is the first think tank in Spain. In particular, at this very moment of radical transformation of international relations and the ensuing global governance crisis, not few private and public actors draw their inspiration from expert knowledge of those think tanks to solve their local, regional, or global problems. Whether we talk about climate change, conflict on Ukraine, or even the tensions between Catalonia and Spain, think tanks have become part of the daily news with their reports and their wish to offer narratives and policy ideas that aim to influence public opinion and policies. Hence, for us as international students and scholars, it is a must, both from an academic and a job perspective, to have a first-hand knowledge on the nature, role, and impact of think tanks in international relations. It is for us not only a pleasure, but also a privilege that Professor Donald Abelson, one of the world's leading experts on international relations think tanks and the leading expert on think tanks in the USA and Canada, freed some time in his extremely busy agenda to come over from Canada to provide us with this expert view that we need. I'm afraid that my presentation of Dr. Abelson will not do justice to the impressive curriculum that he sent us. He sent us a summary of 41 pages, so it would need another masterclass to present him adequately. But in order to give an overview of his background, Professor Abelson is an accomplished researcher and teacher at one of Canada's leading academic institutions, the University of Western Ontario. He's a widely published author and expert on Canadian and US think tanks and interest groups, and is an effective administrator with a proven track record of building the Center for American Studies and the Canada-US Institute into a highly visible teaching and research center. From an academic perspective, his education, he has a BA in political science and an MA in political studies, an MA in journalism, and a PhD in political studies for the University of Queens, the Queen's University. With regard to his employment history, he has been involved above all at the University of Western Ontario, where he's currently professor at the Department of Political Science, used to be a chair of the department, and as I said, he has he's currently the director of the Center for American Studies and the Canada-US Institute, which he's heading now. Apart from his numerous articles, the main publications that Dr. Abelson has published is one main publication, Do Think Tanks Matter? Assessing the Impact of Public Policy Institutes, which is translated in Chinese and Arabic by think tanks in China and in the Arab countries in the Gulf. A Capital Idea, Think Tanks and US Foreign Policy. Then there is another one, The Myth of the Sacred, the Charter, the Courts and the Politics of the Constitution in Canada. And then the other one is American Think Tanks and Their Role in US Foreign Policy. In addition to his impressive academic and record and his numerous publications, what is also very interesting for me to see is that Dr. Abelson holds various distinctions and honors awarded by his university students for his excellent and effective teaching skills. So he has 3 USC Teaching Honor Roll Awards of Excellence and was also awarded the University Student Council Teaching Award of Excellence twice. So thank you once again, Professor Abelson, for accepting our invitation. I'm sure that we are about to witness why you were given these kind of awards, and we look all very much forward to your lecture. Welcome.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you for your invitation to come to your beautiful city and campus today. I have a tendency to like to walk as opposed to standing behind a podium, so I hope that's okay with you. I think this talk is going to appeal to you on a number of levels, not the least of which is it's going to flow from your areas of expertise in international relations and in the field of communications. Because what you're going to learn this afternoon is that when you study think tanks, whether it's globally or if you focus on a particular region, one of the things that you're going to come to realize is that these organizations are no longer just focused on policy research. That one of the distinctions that think tanks have around the world is the premium that they now place on political advocacy, the marketing of ideas, the politicization of ideas. And think tanks, whether in the United States, Canada, or throughout Europe, could not accomplish the degree of goals they've set for themselves or the visibility that they enjoy had it not been for the priorities they place on marketing, on media exposure. So we're going to talk about some of these themes as they overlap this afternoon. And the other issue that I think you're going to find interesting, particularly given your backgrounds, is that this is a growth area. If we were having this discussion 25 years ago, when I began thinking about think tanks, in all likelihood we'd be talking about a handful of organizations in the US and abroad. But as my colleague just pointed out, think tanks are on the rise. There are close to 7,000 of these institutions around the globe. And many of these organizations hire people like you who have expertise in politics, who have expertise in communications, because you satisfy the skill set they need. People who have a strong academic background, but have an eye to promoting ideas in the most effective manner possible. So let's start by talking about the world of think tanks. And anytime I go too quickly or anytime I use a term that's confusing, please just raise your hand and I'll clarify it to the best of my ability. The first thing that we need to know when we think about think tanks is that think tanks have indeed become a global phenomenon. So again, 25 years ago, the bulk of the literature, well, the literature that did exist at the time, focused primarily on think tanks in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And why did the literature focus on think tanks in those two particular countries? Well, if you go back to the late 1800s or early 1900s, that's where most of the world's think tanks existed. In London, in Washington, some scattered throughout the world, but for the most part, they were focused in North America and in the United Kingdom. One of the problems, one of the frustrations in working in this particular area is coming to terms with what a think tank is. It's a term that you've all heard of. You see people appear on the news from world-renowned think tanks, but the question is, what really is a think tank? Well, one of the problems is that scholars who study this eclectic and diverse population have yet to come to terms with what a think tank really is, in large part because there are no two that look exactly alike. Well, if we can't define them, how do we study them? It's obviously an important methodological question. Well, one of the things that we've done is to focus on identifiable characteristics. So, while we're going to talk about think tanks around the globe, a lot of my discussion is going to focus on the American experience. And you might say, well, why in the American experience? The American think tank experience is important because think tanks around the globe, whether they're in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, over the last 10 to 15 years have tried to emulate what has gone on in the United States. In particular, what has gone on in Washington, D.C. among top-tier think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Brookings Institution. So whether we're discussing think tanks in Italy, Spain, Greece, wherever it might be, one of the things that people often talk about is how do they emulate the American think tank experience? How do they generate the kind of budgets like the Brookings Institution and the Heritage Foundation have? How do they achieve the level of notoriety and influence that these organizations do? And so we're going to talk about it this afternoon because the reality is that in the United States, you have a perfect set of conditions, what I often refer to as a perfect storm. All the conditions that you need in order to develop, promote, and market think tanks are there. Now, some of these conditions exist in countries around the globe, but there's no other country that has all the conditions necessary for this level of success. Well, let's get back to the issue of identifiable characteristics. What do think tanks share in common? Generally, think tanks are not for-profit organizations. So for those of you who are interested in NGOs, this is one area that you might want to focus on. So they're not for-profit organizations. In the United States, think tanks are registered under the Internal Revenue Code. If you're ever having trouble going to sleep at night, just Google the Internal Revenue Code, read a few passages, and you'll be out like a light. They're tax exempt. What does that mean? They don't pay tax. There are only two types of organizations in the United States that don't pay tax. Any idea what those are? How do you qualify for tax exempt status? Yes. Excellent. If you're a religious institution, that's one. You don't pay any tax. What's the other? Great answer. What's the other? yes, they're NGOs, but it's something about the NGO. You're all at what kind of institution? Foundation, you're an educational institution. So if you're an educational institution, you pay no tax. Think tanks qualify not because they're religious in any way, although few might claim to rule through divine intervention. They are tax exempt because they claim to have an educational mission. So if you go to the Internal Revenue Code and you look at Chapter 501c3, organizations, you will find think tanks because they qualify as educational. Now I have C4, C3, C4, what does that mean? Well, this is going to go along with the theme that we're going to talk about this afternoon, about the politicization of expertise. When think tanks began to emerge in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were created as institutions that could bring together academics from different disciplinary backgrounds who could bring their scientific expertise to bear on complex government issues. Mathematicians, social scientists, historians, people who could help government think its way through complex policy issues, domestic policy and foreign policy. Over time, as we're going to talk about, think tanks have become more politicized. The nature of expertise has become far more politicized. Well, let's go to C3 versus C4. If you're a C3 organization in the United States, in exchange for getting tax-exempt status, not paying any tax, you are prohibited from engaging in certain types of political activities. You can't publicly support or oppose a candidate running for the US Congress. You cannot give money to a political party. You cannot engage in a mass demonstration that has political overtones. You have to remain at arm's distance from parties, from partisan activities. Many think tanks in the United States have become frustrated by this because they want to become more advocacy-oriented. They want to become more involved in the political process, but the IRS won't allow them to do that. So what have they done? In the last number of years, they've created what are called C4 organizations, which allow them legally to engage in more advocacy-oriented activities. So let me give you an example. The Heritage Foundation in Washington, created in 1973. We'll talk about heritage in a few minutes. The Heritage Foundation is audited almost every year by the Internal Revenue Service because of the kinds of activities that they become involved in. So a number of years ago, they said to themselves, well, we're limited because of the C3 designation, but let's create a sister organization called a C4, which allows them to engage in advocacy. So it's almost as if I split this room down the middle. And on this side, I create one organization that's engaged in research. And on the other side, we have an organization engaged in advocacy. You have a separate budget, you have separate staff, you have separate objectives. You are governed independently, but at the end of the day, you're really joined at the hip. And that's what some think tanks have done, so they can have their cake and they can eat it too. Nonpartisan. This is not something that's normal in other countries around the world. My colleague from Spain and I just had a brief chat about this. In Germany, there are many think tanks that are aligned with political parties. They're funded by the state. But in the United States, the vast majority of think tanks are nonpartisan. This should not be confused with being non-ideological. So nonpartisan, as I said, has to do with the kinds of political activities in which they're engaged. And finally, for a think tank to be recognized as a think tank, they have to be research-oriented, have a commitment to shaping public opinion and public policy. Common types of think tanks that you may have heard about. And again, there are a lot of different typologies out there in the literature. My colleague and friend, Kent Weaver, I think produced probably the most manageable typology that really focuses on 3 different types. One he referred to as universities without students, so organizations that look like universities. They don't teach students, but their scholars have PhDs, they adhere to strong and rigorous academic standards, so they look like universities. Students aren't there, but the kind of research and the quality of research that's produced would very much mirror what you'd expect from traditional universities. Government contractors are specialists. The most famous government contractor in the world, the RAND Corporation, created in Santa Monica in 1946, 1947. It is funded by the U.S. Department of Defense almost entirely and works for different government agencies. And the advocacy think tanks, the think and do tanks, which we're going to talk a lot about this afternoon, represent the lion's share of think tanks around the globe. These are think tanks that combine policy research with aggressive marketing techniques. Oh, universities without students, one would be the Brookings Institution in Washington. RAND Corporation for Government Contractors on the domestic side would be the Urban Institute, inspired by President Lyndon Johnson. Advocacy think tanks, the list goes on and on. Quintessential advocacy think tank would be the Heritage Foundation. Select profile of think tanks worldwide. Again, as my colleague pointed out, there are close to 7,000 think tanks worldwide. They can be found in virtually every country and region of the world. Some that you may have heard of: Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, founded in 1910. It grew out of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Over 70 staff, budget in excess of £10 million. Bruegel in Belgium, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in the UK, Center for European Studies, the French Institute of International Relations, Japan Institute of International Affairs, Fraser Institute from my own country, based in Vancouver, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and Demos. Overview of some American think tanks that you may have heard of. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. For years, Carnegie produced a journal that I'm sure many of you have read called Foreign Policy. And Carnegie marks itself as the first global think tank. It has offices around the world. Carnegie and the Brookings Institution are physically joined at the hip. They are side by side. So for those of you who've been to Washington, D.C., and you become interested in think tanks, the place that you want to hang out is an area called DuPont Circle. You can get off the line at DuPont. DuPont Circle is where the hub of think tank activity is in Washington, D.C., so Brookings and the Carnegie Endowment are side by side. They actually share the same lobby. The Brookings Institution, I give the date of 1916. The Brookings Institution is, in all likelihood, the most famous think tank in the world. 1916 is a little deceiving because it actually began its life as the Institute for Government Research and later on merged with two other bodies to become incorporated as Brookings in 1927. It has over 250 staff and a budget in excess of $95 million. Just to give you an example, in my own country of Canada, there are probably about 24 viable think tanks. If you add up the budgets of all of them, you don't get to $95 million. That's one think tank. The Hoover Institution, 1919, based at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. Very, very interesting think tank. The Council on Foreign Relations, which also grew out of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. The Council on Foreign Relations and Chatham House were supposed to be the same institute, and there were discussions underway in Paris in 1919 to create one organization, and the two ended up becoming separate institutions. The American Enterprise Institute, I'm going to talk about briefly. AEI was directly tied to the surge in Iraq. So President Bush's controversial policy over the surge in Iraq, many people argue that the recommendations for the surge came directly out of AEI. The RAND Corporation we've talked about briefly. The Heritage Foundation, we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. The Center for American Progress was created shortly after the Clinton administration came to an end. Was founded by John Podesta, Bill Clinton's former chief of staff. Now enjoys a budget in excess of $25 million. Just a pictorial overview of some of the major think tanks in DC and outside the Beltway: Brookings, Carnegie, Hoover, AEI, RAND. Now let's talk about why think tanks thrive in the United States, and we can draw some comparisons with other countries. And these conditions are really important to understand if you intend to do any kind of comparative research. First, in the United States, you have a highly fragmented and decentralized political system that provides multiple channels of access for think tanks and other NGOs. Well, what does this mean? It means that, unlike in some parliamentary democracies, where access is limited, in the United States you have separate branches that share power. So Congress, the executive, the judiciary, provides multiple channels of access to, for think tanks to political leaders. Weak political parties. People often say, what do you mean? Political parties are strong in the United States. Not really, they're actually quite weak. They're weak in the sense that parties are not constrained by party loyalty. So unlike in some parliamentary systems like Canada and Britain, Democrats and Republicans are free to vote according to the wishes of their constituents. They're not bound by party unity, so they frequently cross party lines. The other thing that's interesting about this is when you look at the role of the US Congress, you have 535 what I refer to as free agents. They can vote however they want. They can pick up an idea from a think tank and run with it. You can add in 3 non-voting members from the District of Columbia. So you have 538 people who are more than happy to listen to ideas that will allow them to gain some traction with their constituents, particularly during election years. This does not happen in many other democracies. Distrust of government. So if you look at dollar bills from the United States, the famous greenback, what does it say on the back of the bill? It says, "In God we trust," not in government we trust. So in the United States, policymakers have a great distrust of government. So there's a tendency to look outside government for expertise and advice. Unlike in Canada, for instance, where there's greater distrust in the external policy research community and far more trust in the people who've served in government for many, many years. The absence of a permanent senior civil service. Some of you will go on to pursue careers in government after you graduate with an undergraduate or possibly graduate degree. The United States is a good place to go because every time there's a change in administrations, guess what happens? But 5,000 to 8,000 positions open up. So in 2016, when the United States has a new president, the top layer of the bureaucracy will change. There's no history of a permanent senior civil service. So in Great Britain, in Australia, in Canada, that remains relatively intact. So people who are working at think tanks, they write a couple books, they become experts in particular areas, and then they say to themselves, I'd like to have an opportunity to translate some of these ideas into actual policies. What better place to do that than working at the Defense Department or the State Department, wherever it might be. So when administrations change and 5,000 to 8,000 positions go with it, young people at think tanks look at openings in government and say, yeah, that's the place that I'd like to spend the next 4 years. They go to work in government, maybe the administration comes to an end, maybe they're 2 terms, they return to a think tank and they continue their research. A strong culture of philanthropy in the United States, and this is key to understanding think tanks. Say what you will about the United States. We can criticize the United States on its domestic policy, healthcare. I teach a course in American politics, and my students are shocked every year when I tell them that there are 50 million Americans walking around without health insurance. 50 million. Add several million more who have inadequate health insurance. You can criticize the United States for its foreign policy abroad. And around the world, we've been very, very critical of what the United States has done in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in other countries. The one thing you cannot criticize the United States for is not being a generous country. There's no other country in the world that gives as much money to different causes as Americans. Now, you might say, well, they do that for political reasons. Absolutely. But if not for philanthropic foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, many of these think tanks would never exist. That might not be such a bad thing, but the relationship between think tanks and philanthropic foundations are critically important. Let me give you an example. Several years ago, the Washington Post, right, famous newspaper, wrote a series of articles on philanthropic giving in the United States. And in one of the issues, they featured Richard Mellon Scaife. Richard Mellon Scaife is a Pittsburgh steel billionaire. And the article pointed out that over the course of 25 years, Richard Mellon Scaife had donated in excess of $500 million to various conservative organizations in the United States. Think tanks, universities, other causes, $500 million. The next paragraph began, and of course I'm paraphrasing, if you think that's a lot of money, the Ford Foundation in any given year donates in excess of $1 billion in 1 year. When you compare the United States to other countries around the world in terms of philanthropic giving, it's like night and day. So when you look at think tanks, you have to look at their relationship with philanthropic donors. It's critically important. A strong and active class of policy entrepreneurs. What do I mean by that? Policy entrepreneurs. Many of you might go on to become policy entrepreneurs. People who have a vision, people who've had political experience, people who look for funding to back a particular set of philosophical beliefs. Most of the think tanks in the United States have been created by policy entrepreneurs from the private sector, not the public sector, from the private sector. So there's a strong tradition of policy entrepreneurship. And finally, the revolving door phenomenon. Remember a few minutes ago I talked about scholars at think tanks wanting to go into government to get some practical experience, and then after their government experience ends, they come back to a think tank. That's called the revolving door. The most fun scholars who study think tanks have when they look at this particular topic is when administrations come to an end, because then we can track who leaves government, where they go, and where people from think tanks end up in office. So the revolving door. The evolution of American think tanks, philanthropy, and policy expertise. Let me just speak very briefly about this. I featured 3 people on this slide. Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish-American-born Pittsburgh steel billionaire. Robert Brookings, a very important figure in the American think tank world. And Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States, who established the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So why do I focus on these 3 particular people? Because the 3 of them shared a desire to create organizations during the so-called progressive era, where they would bring the best and brightest minds of the country together and encourage them to apply their expertise to public policy challenges of the day. Were they politically motivated? Absolutely. But they believed very strongly in the social sciences and felt very strongly in the benefits of social science expertise. And later on, if we have some time, we can talk more about these 3 people because they're critically important in the development of think tanks, not only in the United States, but around the globe. And one person we often don't talk about is Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, for those of you who've studied American history, know that he didn't have a terribly successful run at the presidency. Shortly after he became president, the US was hit with the Great Depression. Hoover lasted 1 term, succeeded by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the most admired presidents in American history. Herbert Hoover lived a fascinating life. I'll tell you one quick story before we move on. Herbert Hoover was orphaned at a very early age. Both of his parents were killed. He was raised by his grandparents in West Branch, Iowa. That's where the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library is. A lot of people think it's at Stanford. It's not. It's in West Branch, Iowa. And Hoover was admitted to what became the first graduating class of Stanford University. He became a mining engineer. His wife, Lou Henry Hoover, also became a mining engineer. Hoover was close to Woodrow Wilson, another president, American president, and from a very early age, he fell in love with books. And he became a very active book collector, a bibliophile. So during the First World War, Woodrow Wilson asked Herbert Hoover if he would come to Europe and spearhead the Commission for Relief in Belgium, basically to coordinate food relief efforts for people who were starving behind enemy lines. And he agreed to do it. And on the passage over to Europe, he was reading the autobiography or the biography of Andrew White, former president of Cornell University. White was also a bibliophile. And Hoover thought to himself on the transatlantic voyage, I will be in a perfect position to collect documents around World War I that will be of enormous value to future generations of students. So when he got to Europe, he wrote back. Of course, there was no internet, no email back then. He wrote back to his alma mater, Stanford University, and requested the support of a handful of history graduate students to help him collect documents on the war, posters, letters, newspapers, whatever he could get his hands on. And they came over, and for months and months and months, he collected documents, sent them back to the United States. That became the basis for the Hoover Library, which is one of the most important historical archives in the United States. It's where Solzhenitsyn went to write the Gulag Archipelago, the Hoover Library. Fascinating, fascinating person. The rise of advocacy think tanks. One of the reasons why we're here today is because of the rise of advocacy think tanks. If not for the rise of advocacy think tanks, in all likelihood, we wouldn't be even talking about this particular subject. So who are these two people on the slide? Well, the first is Edwin Follner. Edwin Follner had a very interesting career until a few years ago. He was president of the Heritage Foundation, a position he held for over 3 decades. He held both a PhD from the University of Edinburgh and a master's degree in business administration from the Wharton School of Business. The gentleman below is no longer living, but his name is Paul Weyrich. And Weyrich and Follner knew each other. They were young conservatives working in Washington in the late 1960s, early 1970s. They were congressional staffers. And one day, they were having breakfast in a cafeteria on Capitol Hill. And before they even sat down to enjoy their pancakes and coffee, they waved a copy of a report at each other. And the report was on the supersonic transport plane. It was a very controversial policy issue in the early 1970s. The question of whether or not the United States should develop this technology, and if they did, who should fund it? Private sector, public sector. And the report had been written by a scholar at a leading American think tank. And they loved the report, despite the fact that it was fairly long, it was clear, it was lucid, it was coherent, it offered a series of policy recommendations that they hadn't seen in other reports. But the problem with the report was it arrived on their desks 3 days after Congress voted on the supersonic transport. So that morning after breakfast, they called the president of the American Enterprise Institute, which is where the report was produced. And the president at the time was a gentleman by the name of William Baruti. And they said, Dr. Baruti, we have this wonderful report in front of us on the supersonic transport that one of your scholars wrote. He said, oh, I'm glad you liked it. They said, we love the report. The problem is it arrived on our desk 3 days after the vote in Congress. Can you explain why? To which Baruti responded, because we didn't want to influence what took place in the US House of Representatives and in the Senate. And at that point, the idea for creating the Heritage Foundation was born. What the Heritage Foundation decided to do very early on was to combine policy research with political advocacy. And they did this from a very conservative perspective. They realized that for think tanks to have any political traction, that they had to move away from the traditional model of research, which was embraced by the Brookings Institution. Instead of simply producing book-length studies, which few people read, they decided to focus on timely and policy-relevant research. Short, pithy, concise policy briefs. They called it the so-called briefcase test. 4 to 5 page reports outlining recommendations on key policy issues that could be read in the time it took to get from Reagan National to Capitol Hill, which is about a 15-minute taxi ride. They had to be quick, they had to be aggressive, and they had to be poignant. They also realized how important it was to enhance their media exposure. And this was one of the first think tanks that came to the realization that it wasn't just about the research, it was about the marketing of ideas. It was about the promotion. And for them, for a think tank to truly be successful, they had to combine both. So I have this little diagram of a pendulum. And as you know, pendulums tend to move from one point to another, and then they come back in the middle. Well, the pendulum in the United States and the think tank community has gone from policy research to political advocacy, but guess what? It's not coming back. It's stuck. So research advocacy, you expect it to return. Guess what? It's not returning. The impact that the Heritage Foundation had on generations of think tanks, not only in the United States, but around the globe, has been significant. Because they realized very early on that for think tanks to have an impact, they had to reach the public, they had to reach Capitol Hill and other multiple stakeholders in a timely and aggressive fashion. Let's talk very quickly about policy outputs, something that think tanks can control. And we're going to use this as a segue into discussion about influence. So policy outputs, what is it that think tanks do? So if you go onto their websites, what are the kinds of things that you're going to look for? Well, we know that they provide a lot of media exposure. We call them talking heads, so whether you go on CNN or BBC, wherever it might be, you often see experts providing commentary on important policy issues. Media exposure has become unbelievably important to think tanks. There are many think tanks in Washington that have their own TV studios, not unlike the ones that you have. Radio studios, satellite communication. Let me tell you a quick story. You may not have heard of this gentleman, but look for his name should Hillary Clinton run in 2016. His name is Michael O'Hanlon. Now, Michael O'Hanlon is a defense policy analyst at the Brookings Institution. Very, very smart guy. Writes probably about a book a year. And I had an interview with Michael O'Hanlon several years ago working on a project at the Brookings Institution, and no sooner did I walk into the lobby of Brookings, Michael grabs my arm and he goes, Don, quick, 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 I've got to do an interview on Fox News, but I can talk to you between the commercial breaks. So I said, well, you sure you want me to go into the studio with you, Michael? Why don't you do your interview? I'll just sit out here. I'm fine. He goes, no, 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 come on in. I said, you sure? He said, come on in, come on in. So rush into the studio at the Brookings Institution, and there are two chairs. I'm off camera, he's on camera. The producer of the show comes out and he goes, Michael, we are on in 3, 2, 1. All of a sudden, lights go on. Bill O'Reilly, Fox News, joining me this morning, Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution to talk about the latest threat posed by China. Michael, good morning. Good morning, Bill. How are you? So for 30, 40 seconds, he gave the most lucid response I've ever heard on the strategic threat posed by China. Didn't even flinch. Nothing. Flawless. Unbelievable. Oscar-winning performance. Cameraman comes out, okay, Michael, we're off. So, Don, what do you want to talk about this morning? And we talked about think tanks. This went on for about 5 minutes. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The type of people they look for at think tanks have that unique skill set. They have expertise and they can communicate in ways that few other people can. That's what makes them successful. Other outputs, congressional testimony. Often you'll see members from think tanks testify before a House or Senate committee. Recruitment of staff into government. Give you another example. Talked about the Heritage Foundation, founded in 1973. What was one of the first things that the Heritage Foundation did? They created a database for young conservatives coming to Washington, and they tried to match them up with vacancies in government. What a brilliant thing to do. They received thousands and thousands of resumes, young college graduates looking for their first jobs in Washington, and the Heritage Foundation had a complete list of vacancies in government. It was like a dating service. It was like Match.com, eHarmony, whatever they call them, to match young conservatives with potential job openings. And it worked very, very well. It allowed them to extend their reach into government. Other outputs, academic citations that we often worry about, publications that take different forms, workshops, conferences, and seminars, and of course, their budget. Key stakeholders. So it's one thing to generate ideas, but somebody's got to listen, right? You have to disseminate ideas to someone. Otherwise, they're going to either remain in your mind or on your computer or on your bookshelf. So what are the stakeholders that think tanks target? National and international organizations. So many reports that Heritage, Brookings, the American Enterprise Institute put out are targeted to key national and international bodies. Global think tanks. I referred to the Carnegie Endowment as the first global think tank. Well, there are many think tanks in North America that have offices around the globe, strong ties to European think tanks. The Adam Smith Institute in the UK is one that enjoys very close ties to Heritage, and there are many, many others. Policymakers we've already talked briefly about, both in the executive and legislative branches. Think tanks target bureaucratic departments and agencies to extend their reach. Media we've talked about, philanthropic organizations, very important. Other academics, corporations, and the public. And the other thing to keep in mind very briefly is that think tanks do operate in a world of their own, but they have a foot in two worlds, the policymaking world and in the academic world. Do think tanks matter? Outputs versus outcomes. This is really interesting. There are two competing narratives going on in the think tank universe. The first narrative is constructed by those people who direct think tanks. They're like CEOs of companies. So if you're the CEO of a company, part of your obligation is going to be to satisfy your board of trustees or your board of directors. And how do you think you do that? If you're a for-profit organization, you know how you have to do that. You have to increase your bottom line, right? You have to show that in this quarter you performed a whole lot better than in the previous quarter. If you're a not-for-profit organization, there is no bottom line. The bottom line is how much influence you wield, how much do you exercise. So one of the narratives comes from directors of think tanks who will try to convince their key stakeholders that they have enormous influence. They will equate public visibility with policy influence. So they'll look at their media exposure, and they'll say, there's no other think tank that's generated more exposure than we have. Therefore, we must have the most influence. Public visibility is equated with policy influence. There's a second narrative going on, and that's a narrative created in the academic world. And all of you are being trained to think critically about a host of issues, to look at issues from a truly interdisciplinary perspective, whether your focus is on economics, politics, history, whatever it might be. And you know that you've got to peel back the layers. You have to look at issues through multiple lenses. That's what you do. That's why you're here. That's what academics do. So we know that there's a huge difference between outputs that you have some control over and outcomes which you have very little control over. Outcomes are decisions that government leaders make, decisions that Barack Obama is going to make tomorrow, decisions that leaders around Europe are going to make in the next few months. Those are outcomes. So the question is, what is the relationship between outputs and outcomes? What you produce and the decision that's made. Think tanks want to convince you that they have considerable control over outputs and outcomes. The reality is they don't. But that's the narrative that has developed over time. Let's talk very briefly, and then I'll bring this to an end, on models of influence. Because one of the reasons that we talk about think tanks, and one of the reasons we talk about interest groups and other types of advocacy organizations, is because we believe that these organizations have enormous influence. These people are not elected to government. You don't vote for them. I don't vote for them. But if they have enormous influence in shaping policy outcomes, shouldn't we know more about them? Why do you think there's so much focus on organizations like the National Rifle Association in the United States? How many of you have you heard about terrible shooting tragedies in the United States over the last year or so? Gunmen walking into schools, gunning down young children, killing their teachers. Gun control is a huge issue in the United States. Not in Canada. We don't have guns. The United States has guns. Millions of them. So there's an organization called the National Rifle Association that is supported in principle by a number of conservative think tanks. They have one issue. It's focused on the Second Amendment to the US Constitution. It's called the right to bear arms. It's their issue. They will oppose any type of legislative activity intended to constrain gun ownership. So I've said to my students, and I teach a course on this, and during the course, another shooting tragedy happened in the States. I said, look at what happens over the next 48 hours. Parents are going to mourn the loss of their children. Legislators are going to be outraged. The media is going to become involved. And they're going to talk about this tragedy, just like the one that happened a year ago. And in 48 hours, representatives from the National Rifle Association are going to appear on television and on radio, and they're going to try and convince you that guns don't kill people, people kill people. And then, despite the efforts of a handful of members of Congress to introduce meaningful gun control legislation, things like you shouldn't be able to buy a gun at a gun show without a check, sounds reasonable to me. Do you know in the United States, I live 45 minutes from the Michigan border. Do you know that you could go to a gun show, and they're held almost every weekend, and you could walk in so long as you're 18 years old, and you can buy a semi-automatic weapon, and you don't have to go through a background check. They don't have to check your psychological makeup. They don't have to see if you have a criminal record. So long as you have money in your pocket, you're walking away not only with the ammunition, you're walking away with a semi-automatic weapon. You know, the same kind of semi-automatic weapon that killed dozens of young kids in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. But that's okay. If you go to a gun store in the United States, there's a background check. You go to a gun show, you want a gun, you can have it. No questions asked. There are many people, including me, who find that offensive. The NRA doesn't, because you're limiting their Second Amendment rights. So when we talk about think tanks and interest groups, it's not in the abstract. This is not an academic exercise on a topic that has little relevance. It has profound relevance because there are people who come up with ideas. Some are great, some are idiotic, some are loony. And their whole goal is to try and shape public opinion and public policy. We need to understand more about them. Well, let's talk about influence for 2 seconds. One of the areas where political scientists have not done a good job is in studying the nature of policy influence. We're very good at studying power. We're great at studying power. We can assess economic power, military power, social power, political power. We can do it. We can do it in every country of the world. We're not very good at assessing influence. And when I was a student, when I was your age, many, many years ago, my professors taught me that power and influence were the same thing. If you had power, you had influence. They were used interchangeably. The United States is the strongest military power in the world. Guess what? Hasn't been able to achieve the kind of influence it's looking for. Why is that? Power and influence are two very different things. When we look at influence, we often study it according to a linear model. Influence is defined as the ability of A to convince B to do X. I'm the director of a think tank. I'm trying to convince you as a member of Congress to introduce a particular policy. Influence can also be defined as the ability of A to convince B not to do X. I don't like what you're thinking. I'm going to do whatever I can to convince you not to do it. Or A, influence can be defined as the ability to maintain the status quo. I like what you're doing. You're doing a great job. I wouldn't change a thing. Influence is presented as an all or nothing proposition. Either you have it or you don't, according to the linear model. My suggestion to you, as you continue your training in analytical thinking, is to start thinking outside the box. If this is the model that you adopt in studying think tanks or interest groups or other types of NGOs, it's not going to take you to where you want to go. Because the influence that think tanks and other similar organizations achieve can best be explained by looking at different stages of the policy cycle. The bulk of think tank activity doesn't occur later on in the policy process when decisions are made. When is it made? Or when is the influence felt? Very early on, when the parameters of policy issues are being framed. That's why the media becomes so important to think tanks, because they're trying to frame the issues. Go back and think about the Iraq War. What did think tanks talk about? Not whether or not to go to war. That decision was already made. How to fight the war. Think tanks played a very important role in framing that discussion. Let me close by providing you with two concrete examples, and then we'll wrap it up, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. One of the things that we've tried to do over the last number of years is to focus on specific cases where we could demonstrate the kind of influence that think tanks have achieved, whether it's in the United States, Great Britain, Germany, France, wherever it might be. And there are two cases that I focus on a fair bit, and let me just share some initial findings. One area that continues to generate some interest is national missile defense. For those of you who've done any reading on the Reagan years during the height of the Cold War, go back to March 1983. I know none of you were born during that time, or very few of you were. March 23rd, 1983, Ronald Reagan got on national television and he proposed the creation of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, soon to be dubbed Star Wars. And at that point, he called on the scientific community to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. So what is the background of this? When Reagan was running for the presidency in 1980, he, along with Martin Anderson, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, went to NORAD headquarters, North American Aerospace Command. And they had a tour by a US general talking about nuclear strategy. So Reagan, out of nowhere, says to the general, "Sir, what is to prevent a Soviet ballistic missile, Soviet nuclear tip missile from entering American airspace?" And he looked at Reagan as if he was from Mars. He said, "Nothing, sir. Nothing is to prevent it." And Reagan was shocked. And he said, "Governor Reagan, for years, the United States has pursued a doctrine called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. If we launch, the Soviets launch. If they launch, we launch. It's Armageddon. You have about 20 minutes to find a location. It's not going to be secure, but you have 20 minutes. And the United States and Moscow, for all intents and purposes, will disappear. Our nuclear strategy is based on the fact that we consider ourselves rational. The Soviets hopefully consider themselves rational. And it would be an irrational act to engage in nuclear warfare. But there's nothing to prevent us from shooting down a Soviet nuclear missile. It would basically be the end of humanity. And he was shocked. At that time, he was approached by Daniel Graham. Daniel Graham was just starting a think tank called High Frontier. He said, "Governor Reagan, if you don't like the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, I have another suggestion. I'm coming up with this idea of creating both a ground-based and space-based defense system that can track, intercept, and destroy incoming missiles. It'll be a shield. It'll be an umbrella. We're going to share it with our European allies. They're going to love it. It's going to give us both a sword and a shield." And Reagan grabbed onto the idea. And High Frontier, as a think tank, working with the Heritage Foundation, ended up achieving significant notoriety. Fast forward 30 years, it's still on the agenda. Its name has changed, but it's still there. The events of 9/11. Many political pundits said, in the aftermath of 9/11, national missile defense is no longer going to be on the table, because even if we had a system like that, there's no way they could have predicted or prevented commercial airliners from being flown into the Twin Towers. It's gone. National Missile Defense is gone. Really? It's gone? I don't think so. A number of think tanks in the United States, Center for Security Policy being one, played a very active role in keeping this issue alive and well, largely with the support of philanthropic donors and other key stakeholders. This is an example of a group of think tanks having an enormous impact. And finally, the surge in Iraq. One think tank that both European and North American journalists focused on a great deal was the Project for a New American Century, PNAC. No longer exists, replaced by another organization called the Foreign Policy Initiative. PNAC, toward the end of the Clinton administration, wrote a public letter to President Clinton urging him to topple Saddam Hussein. They wrote a report called Rebuilding America's Defenses that you can Google and download, recommended that as the United States moved forward militarily, that it consider two things. One, replacing the regime in Iraq, and secondly, learning to fight multiple simultaneous theater wars, Afghanistan, Iraq. The report comes out. A few years later, the Bush Doctrine is announced. Journalists on both sides of the Atlantic focus on this one particular think tank, and they say, that's where the recommendations came from. We later discovered that it wasn't only PNAC, but AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, that also played a very important role in shedding light on the possibility of a surge. But what they were focusing on most were the personal connections between these think tanks and government leaders. Who signed off on the PNAC report? People who would later serve in the Bush administration. Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and others. Bush's inner circle. So let me conclude by saying that think tanks have had an interesting and decisive impact, not only in the United States, but around the globe. They will continue to grow in number. The mortality rate among think tanks is very, very low. They don't tend to die. They reinvent themselves, but they don't die. Think tanks are going to play a very important role in terms of the future of the media in Canada and in the United States. One of the things that we're seeing in North America, and you might be seeing it in Europe as well, are newspapers closing down. So what happens if most major newspapers close down? Who is going to fill the void? Organizations that are media savvy, organizations that have the skill set and the ability and the resources to step in and fill the void. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the Brookings Institution, that in relatively short notice could start running their own newscasts and documentaries and political talk shows. Where are people getting their news from? Blogs. How many people are reading newspapers anymore? So think tanks have laid the foundation for a greater reliance on the media, and in fact, in some respects, can replace it. There'll be more emphasis on advocacy. I showed you the slide about the pendulum. It's not coming back. So for old dinosaurs like me, who remember a time when think tanks generated really interesting research, those days are gone. I have to say, though, that there are some think tanks located outside North America that continue to do very interesting policy research because they haven't been polluted by some of the American think tank experience, and that is refreshing. There'll be less emphasis on policy research. The research that we see will be coming out of our universities. The problem that we have there is there's a very different incentive structure in universities than in think tanks. So if you decide to go to work at a university, which I hope many of you do, you will quickly discover that your life will revolve around your teaching and research and administrative work. Then in order to be promoted, in order to have some type of job security, you're going to have to spend a good part of your life writing books and articles and other things. But one of the things that academics rarely think about are the two terms that I shared with you very early on, timely and relevant. For us, timely takes on a whole different mindset. For think tanks, timely is in the next 48 hours. When academics commit to a book, could be 5 years, could be 7 years, could be longer. How relevant is it? Depends on the subject matter. And finally, we're going to see the continued growth not only of think tanks in the United States, but around the globe. Clearly, they're doing something right. The business model is working for them. And as I pointed out several slides ago, there are a set of conditions in North America, particularly in the United States, that allow these organizations to thrive. Organizations in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, the Middle East, they're looking to this experience. They're well aware of what the Heritage Foundation and Brookings and others have been able to achieve, and they're trying to emulate it. Some things they can, other things they can't, given the nature of the political system that they inhabit. The last thing I want to leave you with is this quick observation that despite the growing visibility and prominence of think tanks around the globe, think tanks do not make public policy. Government makes public policy. Think tanks try to shape it. So with that, let me conclude. Thank you for your patience. I know I've spoken longer than you probably hoped I would, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you. Questions? Related to think tanks, the media, anything you want to talk about? Yes?
We've been reading about how dialect language change, shape, construct reality.
Right.
And the language by governments and official governments provide certain context to make their policies. For example, decontextualizing and dehistoricizing the terrorists,
Right.
for example.
Right.
And according to what you've explained,
Right.
think tanks also play a role in this issue. So
Yeah.
I was thinking if a think tank is, at some extent, sometimes focused on constructing reality, does the scholar have real freedom of expression inside the think tank,
No.
or has an alternative scholar, which is not in the mainstream
Right.
theory, have a room in these think tanks?
It's a great, great question because you're connecting a lot of different and important ideas. One thing that I didn't talk about is just the organization of these institutions. I use the example of the Heritage Foundation, the fact that Ed Follner came from both an academic and business background. The Heritage Foundation is run like a Fortune 500 company. Okay, it's very top down. So if you're a young scholar, you go to work for the Heritage Foundation, you are going to be told what you write about. Okay? So I'm going to pull you into my office and I'm going to say, you know, we need a 5 to 7 page piece on Syrian-American relations. It's Monday, get it to me by Wednesday at 1 and make sure the recommendations align with the mandate of this institution. In other words, that they're fairly conservative. And you turn to me and you say, but sir, I really want to focus on my long-term project on the Arab Spring, but it's going to take me another 6 months. And he'll ask you whether or not you want to stay at the Heritage Foundation or not. So it's very much controlled. If you go to work at other think tanks like the Hoover Institution, which is run like an academic department, you're brought on as a scholar in a particular area. You are free to choose the kind of work that you want to do. Now, at the end of the day, you're going to have to deliver, and it's going to have to be important work, but that's going to be your choice. It's really important to look at how these organizations are managed. In some, the Board of Trustees can play a very important role, a very influential role in setting the research agenda. At other think tanks, scholars are insulated more. Give you another example, the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the most famous think tanks in the world. To produce one book at the Council on Foreign Relations, it's $250,000. One book. You better be right about the topic. So they're all different sorts of management styles and the independence that scholars have, but you are dead on when you talk about think tanks constructing reality. They're constructing a version of reality, one that aligns itself with its particular mandate. And that's why I made the observation that if you're looking at think tank influence and impact, focus very early on in the policy process when issues are being framed and articulated. That's why there's such a hive of media activity. And you know, in the United States, we talk about a perfect union, right? Declaration of Independence. It's a perfect union, or a more perfect union. The relationship between the media and think tanks couldn't be stronger. 24/7 news media, they require a constant flow of information. And you have institutions on the other end who are more than happy to provide it. So what we end up seeing is conservative media outlets going regularly to conservative policy experts, more liberal newspaper outlets or media outlets going to more liberal/progressive scholars, because they realize how important it is to frame discussions, to inject their own reality or the institution's reality into some key policy issues. So it's one thing that think tanks have done very, very well. And that's why I suspect that over the next number of years, the relationship between the media and think tanks will become even more important because it's critical to exposure. And the other reason why it's important is because the more media exposure you have, the more compelling case you can make to potential donors to support your work. So if you're the director of a think tank and you have to meet with your board twice a year, and you walk in with a binder of information and it tells how often your staff have been quoted by major newspapers, or how many op-ed articles have appeared, or how many television interviews you've done, it's a very impressive statistic to have. If, on the other hand, you walk into a board meeting and your binder is very thin and you don't have that data, then as a potential donor, I'm going to say to myself, why am I investing in you? What kind of payback am I getting? Because philanthropic donors, and something I didn't talk about, are not interested in short-term victories. They're interested in shaping the political climate over a long period of time. So if you don't have the capacity to generate the exposure that I'm looking for, why would I invest in you? The Heritage Foundation in any given year is spending $15 million on media relations. $15 million. That's how important it is. So they want to foster an illusion or create the impression that they're the most talked about and written about think tank on the globe. And that's going to pay handsome dividends. So the relationship is very, very important, not only because it enhances visibility, but it helps to convince potential donors that you have something to offer. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Question.
Sure.
You started your presentation talking about that, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon world in general, but the US in particular, has developed a more, let's say, complex network of think tanks,
Yeah.
mainly because of historical reasons
Yeah.
and the academic production in the 18th century. And you've also said that the, let's say, the specific conditions in which the environment of think tanks could take place were given in the US.
Yeah.
So my question is, both in a historical or in a, let's say, conditions perspective,
Yeah.
up to which point Europe, let's say the European Union, we know, has not fulfilled these conditions or has followed a
Yeah.
different historical path
Right.
not to accomplish this dynamic. And
It's okay.
my second question would be, if I had to summarize this let's say, this conference
Yeah.
in an idea, it would be that for me, American politics has become or is becoming, let's say, a business model too. In this business model, I would say that there is private interest of these stakeholders,
Yeah.
these powerful people, and there are issue-centered policies by these private interests. So my question is, until which point, let's say, civil society in America or global civil society should be concerned about this, let's say, privatization of politics?
Okay, well, let's deal with your second question first. I think civil society actually should be very, very concerned, in large part because Not all think tanks in the United States, but the top tier, I think, are becoming more embedded in the policymaking process. And it's interesting because if you go back to late 1960s, early 1970s, one of the other reasons why the Heritage Foundation was created was as a countermeasure to what they perceived to be too much liberal influence from the Brookings Institution. Since the early 1970s, the bulk of financial resources from the private sector has spilled into conservative causes, not more liberal/progressive causes. So it's liberal and progressive institutes that are struggling to keep afloat, with very few exceptions. They should, in civil society, take an interest, in large part because the relationship between think tanks and government leaders is becoming stronger. And it's not to say that government leaders are always turning to think tanks because of their expertise. One of the things that think tanks offer them is an opportunity to reinforce or validate ideas that they have on the campaign trail. So without committing themselves to a particular issue, there are many think tank scholars who become involved. They take a leave of absence and they work on a presidential campaign. They did for Barack Obama. They did for Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. And leaders like associating themselves with think tanks because it's the scholars that are taking the risk. So you write a report on a particular issue, there might be negative fallback, there might be positive, reinforcement, but it's your risk. If I'm running for office, I'm going to tap into your expertise if I know I'm going to gain some traction, but I can still maintain an arm's length relationship to you. So the second question is important because the business model has played out in the think tank world. As you know, American politics has become increasingly partisan. Obama talked about we don't have, blue states and red states, we just have the United States. No, you don't. You do have blue states, you do have red states, and the country's coming apart. What are you going to do about it? Well, despite his best efforts and the efforts of others, it's not coming together. It will become increasingly polarized. The more the country becomes polarized, the more opportunity there is for these organizations to step in and promote ideas. Your first question about some of the differences between European think tanks or when things began to change, we've kind of come full circle. Because when you look at the European experience, when you go back and you look at think tanks in the United Kingdom and beyond, mid to late 1800s, they really started off as laboratories for the study of ideas, right? Policy research was at the core of their mandate. You look at Britain's Fabian Society. You could even look at settlement houses, Hull House in Chicago, at Toynbee Hall in East London. Institutions that were set up to help new immigrants, live in a new country. Well, those were used as laboratories. Hull House in Chicago, which was founded by Jane Addams, a very, very famous figure, brought in sociologists from the University of Chicago. This was in the mid to late 1800s to study the working conditions of the poor and to make recommendations to government on how to address them. Well, what do think tanks do? They focus on issues, they identify problems, and they propose solutions. The radical departure in the United States, in my mind, happened in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when it no longer became about research, it became more about advocacy. And as I pointed out, there's still many European think tanks that have held on to a more traditional model, where what guides them in their work is the quality of their research. There are many French think tanks. One of the leading ones that I cited that I find have a very refreshing approach, because for them it's not about advocacy, it's about the quality of ideas. And they want to maintain some distance from political leaders. So again, it's a very diverse and eclectic community. But if I was to enter that world as a practitioner and not an observer, the trend would be more toward advocacy and aggressive marketing, because it's a business model that has worked. It's now worked for over 30 years. And the organizations that do it well are being rewarded. You don't see these kind of budgets anywhere else in the world. Heritage Foundation last year, $85 million. Brookings, $95 million. The RAND Corporation, I think it's over 200 million. It's a lot of money. Over 260 million. Something's working, right? But again, the problem is you're focusing on the top tier. When you look at the bulk of think tanks, right now there are about 1,800 think tanks in the United States. I'd say less than 1% have budgets in the multi-million-dollar range. Other questions? Yes?
On the topic of how you were explaining first that the US is splitting,
Right.
and it's becoming increasingly partisan.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring up the topic of the fact that you told us that one of the central characteristics of think tanks is that
Yeah.
they are non-partisan.
Right.
But I don't clearly see how that can work.
All right.
Seeing that, as you explained to us, they are top-down organizations, they have a mandate,
Yes.
and therefore they have an agenda.
Yes.
And if you explain to us with the example of conservative think tanks who supported the NRA,
Yes.
I would like to know, A, how can these organizations still claim to be nonpartisan when they clearly have a preference, let's say?
Mm-hmm.
B, how do they actually support interest groups,
Okay.
as for example with conservatives?
Okay. Great question. Partisanship is a legal, or nonpartisanship is a legal requirement, right? So you're absolutely right, but you have to draw a distinction between ideology and partisanship. Every think tank is ideological in some way, whether on the right or on the left, right? When you talk about partisanship, according to the Internal Revenue Service, these are organizations that are providing funds to candidates, you know, whether in support of or in opposition to, or money to political parties. They can't do that. Can they provide advice? Yes. First Amendment. They can provide, they can talk to whoever they want. Now, one of the issues that came up, and I love your question, is the involvement of think tank experts during presidential campaigns, which is a really interesting area to study. This goes back to the Kennedy administration, or the Kennedy campaign in 1960. What has happened over the last number of years is, because of annual audits of some think tanks, scholars who want to work on presidential campaigns, they want to be an advisor, they want to work on a task force, or later on during a presidential transition, have to take a formal leave of absence. So if I'm working at the Brookings Institution and I'm interested in supporting Hillary Clinton in 2016, assuming she runs, I would take a formal leave of absence and I would be paid by the campaign. So I'm selling my services as an independent scholar. I'm not affiliated with my previous employer. Things don't work out, I go back to Brookings. The revolving door. So one thing to look at, one of the things that made the Heritage Foundation famous was a report that they put together for the 1980 campaign. It's called Mandate for Leadership. It was about 1,100 pages, and it's basically a blueprint for a conservative administration. They knew that Jimmy Carter was on his way out. He was going to be a one-term president. So what did Fulner and Weyrich do? They went around the country. They found conservative economists and political scientists and historians. They said, we want to completely change the nature of government. So we're going to have 30 or 40 different chapters looking at every regulatory body, every major government department, and we want you to write about how to reform it along conservative lines. This blueprint was produced, 1,100 pages, hand-delivered by Ed Fulner, the president of the Heritage Foundation, to Edwin Meese, who became Reagan's US Attorney General right after the Reagan campaign. Meese and Fulner had known each other for years. And Fulner said to Ed Meese, Ed, I've got a present for you, hands over. It was just in galley proofs. Here's a report that we've done. Meese said, what is it? He said, it's a blueprint. It's something you're going to have to rely on for the next 4 years. Meese takes it to the president-elect, Ronald Reagan. This is what we have. It's a conservative blueprint. Reagan said, distribute it to all members of the transition team. 2 or 3 years later, Ed Fulner's giving an interview about the impact of Mandate for Leadership, and a Washington Post reporter says, well, how much traction do you think the report has had? Follner says, well, in my estimation, 65 to 70% of the thousands of recommendations that were included in this report have either been implemented or are in the process of being implemented by the Reagan administration. That quote was picked up not only throughout the United States, but around the globe. Do you think one journalist, or one scholar for that matter, tried to verify whether or not that quote was right or not? Did anybody check about which recommendations had been adopted, or if there was an admission by people in the Reagan administration that it was because of the Heritage Foundation that they moved in that particular direction? Not a single reporter, not a single scholar stepped up to the plate and said they're full of it. Excuse my language. That part goes back to your question about framing discussions. Within a short period of time, largely because of the success of that report made it onto the Washington Post bestseller list. How many of you would go out and buy an 1,100-page boring government document report? How did it make its way onto the bestseller list? It wasn't a novel, it wasn't a mystery, it wasn't John Grisham, it wasn't some famous writer. It made the bestseller list because people predicted that there would be such strong ties between the Heritage Foundation and the Reagan administration. They wanted to know what was going to happen over the next 4 years. That's why it made its way onto the bestseller list. Nobody verified it, but that quote was picked up. Every 2 years, the Heritage Foundation produces something on a smaller scale, so for midterm elections and for presidential election years. Other think tanks have followed suit. So they have to be nonpartisan, unless, of course, they create a sister C4 organization. But, of course, they embrace a particular ideology. It doesn't matter which think tank you're focusing on. In terms of the relationship with interest groups, great question. Think tanks are part of larger movements, coalitions. So one of the tricks when you get into this field is, can you trace the origin of an idea? Because that's what we're talking about, to a particular organization or individual. And going back to Martin Anderson at the Hoover Institution, who had this wonderful quote, said, every successful policy idea has 100 mothers and fathers. Every bad idea is an orphan, right? Everyone's going to take credit for things that go right. Everyone's going to abdicate responsibility when they go awry. Think tanks often become part of larger policy coalitions that involve interest groups and advocacy groups and other types of organizations that share concerns over particular policy matters. The Heritage Foundation is a leading organization in the conservative movement. Well, so is the National Rifle Association. So the question is, if you have all these organizations operating under one tent, but you're at odds with some groups and you can align yourselves with others, how is it structured? So the conservative movement, the liberal movement, what are we really talking about? You have dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations, hundreds of organizations that fall under this tent, but who takes a leadership role? Who takes on a subordinate role? How is it managed? And these are all really interesting questions, and the literature in this area is just starting to, I shouldn't say starting to evolve, but it's finally tackling some of these really difficult questions. I think we've been very good at mapping the landscape. We've been very good at looking at key organizational issues, but it's the larger theoretical questions about influence, impact, managing coalitions that we're only beginning, I think, to shed light on. But the relationship between some interest groups and think tanks is quite strong because they're coalescing around similar policy issues. So there's strength in numbers, and if it makes sense to combine resources, maybe they'll do that. The interesting part, though, and this is why I like your question, is because some think tanks are far more open to collaboration than others. There's an organization in the United States called the Concord Coalition, and it's a coalition of liberal and conservative think tanks interested in fiscal and monetary policy that have come together. They sponsor joint workshops and seminars, and they sit on the same panels and they offer different ideas. It's an example of think tanks across the political spectrum working with each other. In the area of foreign policy and in defense policy, it has become far more problematic. Several years ago, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Leslie Gelb, tried to organize a conference that would involve the directors of foreign and defense policy studies at all the major think tanks in the country. And it would be held in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations. And so he brought people in from Brookings and AEI, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Cato, all the top think tanks in the country, all the foreign policy directors. And the first question around the table was, so what are you working on now? Silence. That was it. First and only meeting. They weren't prepared to share. They weren't prepared to compromise their competitive edge. So in some policy areas, there is collaboration. In other policy areas, including international relations, foreign policy, defense studies, some between Brookings and AEI, some between North American and European think tanks that have global partnerships, but it becomes a very sensitive area of concern because they're worried about losing their competitive edge. What does that mean? They're worried about losing donors. And any think tank financial officer who's being honest with you, and they generally are, will tell you that their main target audience, although you might think it's policymakers, it's the people writing the checks. That's how they stay afloat. Yes?
Yeah,
Good afternoon.
I would like to ask you about the future of the think tank.
Okay.
Traditionally, for what you have said, the focus of the think tanks has been on the policy research.
Yes.
But now is more moving to advocacy.
Yes.
Don't you think that if the think tanks do less policy research and they delegate to universities or whatever,
Right.
and they focus more on advocacy, don't you think that this could mean to lose their own essence and to lose influence even though they are more focused on advocacy?
Yes. Two quick responses. One, I would encourage you to take a look at an article by Tebby Troy, T-R-O-Y, appeared in a journal called National Affairs a couple years ago. It was called Devaluing the Think Tank. You can just download it. And he makes a similar argument. So on the policy research side, the argument is that because think tanks are engaging more in political advocacy, their currency, their value has decreased. Right? They're not doing as much innovative, creative, path-breaking research. I agree with him on that point. But the flip side is that now that think tanks are offering a bundle of services that far exceed policy research, in some respects, their currency is actually increased. So you have to look at who they're actually packaging the information for. So if a think tank is packaging information for an academic audience, I agree with you that they're losing credibility. If they're packaging their information for congressional staffers or for people who just want concise reports on an issue, they don't have to be an expert, but they just want a little information, I'd say they're doing quite well. So a lot depends on who their target audience is, what the expectations are, and the kind of services that they provide. And you'll find that in the think tank community, there's some think tanks that have very specialized expertise, could be environmental policy, labor policy, whatever it might be. Others operate as kind of a one-stop policy shop. They cover the entire waterfront. So both things are really happening. On the one hand, their currency is being devalued from the sense that the kind of research they're producing is not as cutting edge. They often simply recycle and repackage and more effectively market ideas. On the other hand, what does the American consumer want? What do members of Congress want? Do they want to sift through a 300-page report on U.S. foreign policy towards Syria? No. No. Do their congressional staffers want to read it? No. What do they want? 4 to 5 pages, 3 pages, 500 words, enough that I can convince you I know what I'm talking about, enough that they can convey to their constituents that they know what they're talking about. I don't have to be an expert on gun control to tell you that As a member from North Dakota, I support the Second Amendment. I don't have to read a 300-page report from a think tank to confirm what I already know. So it's an interesting dynamic, right? It's about deliverables, it's about expectations, and it's about the allocation of strategic resources. Where do they get the most bang for their buck? And I think most think tanks are finding that the most bang for the buck is coming from short, concise, clear policy briefs, not from long studies that few people have the patience or the time to read. So I think both things are happening. Very good question. Yes, sir.
Regarding the slide that's just after, I always, my limited experience of think tanks is that it's basically smart people with laptops. When you compare the budgets there with the number of staff,
Right.
it's a huge disjunct.
Yes.
So what explains that difference?
Well, it's interesting, and getting back to the problem of definition, that you could go home later today, inspired by this talk, and you might decide to set up your own think tank. And you might produce a blog, you might work with other people, you might generate some funds, and that will allow you to gain some exposure and notoriety. Would you satisfy the conditions of a think tank? Well, if the conditions are that you're not for profit, that you're public policy oriented, that you want to shape the way people think, then I'd say yes. The problem is when you look at this community, it is all over the map. So resources vary enormously, staff size varies enormously. The average think tank in the United States is between 12 and 18 staff members. It has a budget of either several $100,000 or a little into the millions, like $1.2 million, $1.5 million. They have a modest publication record. That's the average. Most American think tanks look like Canadian think tanks. We have a tendency, though, to focus on the top tier because these are the ones that generate the most attention. So when you look at Brookings and Carnegie, when you look at the Heritage Foundation, these are the exceptions. These are not traditional, or this is not what the think tank community generally looks like. This is the top tier. This is the top layer. But again, these are the organizations that tend to generate the most exposure, which doesn't surprise many people because if you have the resources, you can do that. These are the think tanks that tend to be most closely aligned with different presidential administrations, so therefore these are the ones that we focus on. But the reality is that most of these organizations out of the 1,800 are relatively small. But they're committed to similar things. The other thing that's interesting about this, though, and someone talked about briefly think tanks in the European Union, this is an area that's very, very interesting to study because think tanks in the European Union see their role very differently than think tanks in the United States. Many think tanks in the European Union want to provide or seek to provide a platform for discussion. They're more focused on networking, beginning conversations, less so on advocacy. So a European Union-style think tank in the United States would not take root. American-style think tanks in all likelihood would not take root within the European Union context. Very different approaches to trying to start policy conversations. In the United States, it is about high pressure, advocacy, aggressive salesmanship. I mean, these are institutes, you go back to the Brookings Institution. This is an institution that holds on a regular basis focus groups on Capitol Hill. Term focus groups mean anything to you? Let's say you're testing a new product on the market, new brand of cereal, a new type of apple juice, whatever it might be. You have a focus group. You get feedback. The Brookings Institution holds focus groups on Capitol Hill to ask congressional staffers whether or not they find their information and expertise relevant or not. And if not, how can they improve? So at the top tier, this is a high stakes political game. So it's interesting because the think tank world is so diverse, but at the top end, millions and millions of dollars are at stake. The lower end, not so much. But that's why so much time and thinking goes into the allocation of resources because you're dealing with multi-million dollar budgets. And if you look at the people who are heading these institutions, look at Brookings, Strobe Talbot, right? Former ambassador at large in the Clinton administration, expert on arms control, former Soviet Union. They are attracting high-priced talent. Jim DeMint, former US senator, is now president of the Heritage Foundation. Can you imagine? You step down from the US Senate, there are 100 US senators, you vacate your seat because you don't feel you're having the kind of influence you would enjoy as president of the Heritage Foundation. That speaks volumes. So he vacates his seat, and now he's president of Heritage, took over for Ed Fulner. So the perception of these organizations has changed dramatically, in large part, I think, because the Heritage Foundation played such an important role. And this is not in any way to endorse their ideas or the approach that they've taken, but they've changed the very complexion of the think tank community, and they've had a considerable impact, getting back to what one of your colleagues mentioned, on interest group behavior in the United States. And one of the interesting things that we've seen is, for think tanks to become more advocacy-oriented, they've looked to interest groups to figure out how they navigate their way through the political system, how they effectively lobby. For interest groups to gain more notoriety and more credibility in the eyes of policymakers, they've begun to allocate far more resources to research. So interest groups are moving in the direction of think tanks are moving in the direction of interest groups, and guess what's happening? The lines between the two have become increasingly blurred. Think tanks now look like interest groups now look like think tanks. What about lobbyists? What about political action committees? What about super PACs that we saw alive and well during the Obama 2012 election, where you had super PACs that are completely unregulated, donating millions of dollars to candidates without proper regulatory mechanisms in place, because the US Supreme Court ruled that that would be unconstitutional. You have think tanks creating sister organizations as a loophole around the Internal Revenue Code so they can become more advocacy oriented. So at the end of the day, what kind of products are policymakers receiving that help inform them about making policy decisions? Rigorous policy research based on scientific data? No. Quick response policy research that they can summarize over coffee with their constituents? Yes. What does that say about the future of social science research? What does that say about universities around the world? Are we going to become more marginalized because we are not part of that world? Are we going to be forced into that world? Colleagues of mine across Europe are being required now in their annual performance evaluations to talk about how much of an impact they've had, their research, and other things. It's all about the numbers. It's about metrics. It's about the corporatization, not only of think tanks, but many universities as well. This is of concern. But if think tanks have become so successful, an argument that Tom Medveds has made in a recent book, will this further marginalize the role that academics play in the social sciences? Because policymakers don't want to read 300-page books. They're more than happy to access a blog or a short description of a policy issue. So do academics become more or less relevant? So it's tied. The one thing that fascinates me about this topic is it's tied to so many different things. You don't have to be a political scientist. You know, it's truly interdisciplinary, because the issues that it raises, I think, speak volumes not only about the political process, but society, you know, in general, and where we're headed. So, good question. Other questions you might have? Thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Don, for your very interesting and also very inspiring talk. I think you offered us a view on the think tanks from seeing it from multiple lenses. Let's leave it for today with this, and tomorrow we'll continue at 12:30, also here in the auditorium. Thanks very much. Bye.